You'll need to bear with me as I chair the first session. The first item of business today is a decision on whether to take item 4, which is consideration of the evidence we will receive today on food banks in private. Are members agreed? The second item of business today is our second evidence session on the issue of food banks and whether there are possible links to the UK Government's welfare reforms. I'd like to welcome a roundtable of witnesses. They are Dave Kilgour, City Strategist, Aberdeen City Council, Mark Ballard, Head of Policy, Bernardo Scotland, Dr John Ip, GP, British Medical Association. Given I've got tonsillitis today, you're particularly welcome, Dr Ip. Keith Dryborough, Policy Manager, Citizens Advice Scotland, Jamie Livingston, Head of Oxfam Scotland, Barbara Kendall, Divisional Director for Community Services, West Scotland Division of the Salvation Army, Kay McIntosh, Tackling Poverty Team Manager, South Lanarkshire Council. The way this is set up, and we've used this format previously, the roundtable format is designed to allow members to ask questions directly of those of you who have kindly come along and given your time today, but also to encourage interaction between everyone around the table. It's worked very well for us in the past, so hopefully it will work well today. Just to kick things off, I want to ask a general question. Lord Freud, the Welfare Reform Minister, has said that the increase in food bank use demand predates his welfare reforms, that there is no evidence of a causal link between the rise and welfare reform. But at this committee, Dr Philip Sisenko of Heriot-Watt University told us that welfare reform was a major factor fuelling demand for food aid, and the evidence in this is robust and reliable. So this is just a general question. In your experience, are the UK Government's welfare reforms, particularly increasing use of sanctions, a contributing factor in the rise for demand for emergency food aid? Who'd like to go first on that one? Keith?
Okay. Just to say, at Citizens Advice Bureau, our experience it has been rising the last 2 or 3 years, and it has predates the Welfare Reform Act. But there were a number of changes that the government brought in, aside from that, tax credit changes, the tightening of the sanctions regime, which we didn't need to do through the Act. So those came in earlier, and actually those are probably, alongside the ESA assessment, reassessment, the biggest factors in food bank demand. So, and then lastly, the Acts brought in bedroom tax and things, which has just further increased it. But there's a range of things that happens before the Welfare Reform Act that actually contributed towards it. In terms of our own experience at Citizens Advice Bureau, sanctions in particular is a major cause of the referrals and signposting that we have to make. I think in January to March we had to signpost 1,300 clients to food banks, and that's about 1 in 50 of our clients in that period. We've done a recent survey of advisors, frontline advisors, and they found that 90% of them agreed that sanctions were directly leading to increased demand for food parcels. So both our sort of national evidence and the on-the-ground coal-face evidence is pointing towards welfare reform.
A GP experience, we're clear that the sanctions that patients experience during their journey through the DWP is impacting both on their mental health and also on their financial health. I've got many reports from GPs who see patients who are going through that journey, and they tell stories of the system actually being very rigid, very unfriendly. Patients have difficulty trying to find their way through it, understanding the rules. Forms can be very complex. Rules and certainly when people have to sign on, etc. The rules for the work-related activities group, if they're on ESA, can be extremely stringent. And if people inadvertently don't follow the rules completely, then their benefits are sanctioned. They often come to the GP in extreme distress, very stressed, and looking for support from the NHS. So that's having a significant impact on GP workload in a time when workload pressures are quite extreme anyway. We know about the ageing population, the increasing complexity of healthcare needs. But my experience, and certainly the experience of my colleagues, is that welfare reform and the way that it's been carried out is having a significant impact on GP services.
Particular reference to food banks, though, is this something you're aware of? Your patients, your colleagues reporting that their patients are increasingly going to food banks? Is this an issue?
Yes, yeah. It's. I mean, as we all know, food banks are increasing their services, and we feel certainly that it's due to it's demand led rather than supply led. I think there's a thought that if food banks increase their supply, then people will go. But what we're seeing, and certainly we saw this before the expansion of food bank services, was that many patients, especially in the most vulnerable groups in our society and in very poor areas of the country, are experiencing severe financial distress, and a significant contributor of that is the welfare changes.
I should have said earlier, if people want to contribute, just indicate. Let me know. I've got Mark and Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting Barnardo's to attend this morning's event. For Barnardo's, we carried out some research recently across the UK looking at the changing pattern of food bank use. And we found that around 90% of the Barnardo's services we talk to now use food banks. Almost all those services said that they had seen an increase in demand for food bank use. But in addition, nearly half of Barnardo's services now directly supply food and other essentials in emergency situations to families they work with. And we've also seen an increase in demand. We've always had a small grant scheme. We're now seeing much greater use of that scheme. In terms of where that demand's coming from, I think it's worth recognising that there are a range of factors that are contributing. Keith Dryburgh and Dr. Yip have already mentioned the issues around benefit sanctions, delays in benefit payments. I think it's also worth highlighting the impact of things like the bedroom tax, which means that families are substituting money that would have gone on food to pay the housing, the element of their housing costs, which is no longer covered because of the bedroom tax. But in addition, I think it's worth recognising that there has been an issue about the rising cost of food and other essentials. The research we've done indicates that food prices rose between 19% and 47% between 2007 and 2012. That's the cost of essential goods. And for many of the families we work with, that's also been a factor in making food unaffordable. And this goes wider than food banks. I think it's worth referencing as well that research from the Institute for Fiscal Studies indicated that increasing numbers of single-parent households and households with young children are making a switch from fresh fruit and vegetables towards cheaper processed food, which also has a long-term impact on diet and on health. So there's a range of factors contributing, but I think the evidence is pretty unequivocal from the front line. There is an increase in demand, but there are a range of factors that are contributing to that.
Thanks, Mark. Jamie.
Clearly, Oxfam is best known for our work around the world, but for the last 20 years or so we've been working in the UK. And it's fair to say that the rise in hunger worldwide has gone along with developed countries. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a big rise in the number of people in developed countries who are needing food support. In Scotland, I think what I was struck with reading the submissions today was the broad agreement as to the causes of surges in food bank use, and I don't think it's credible to say that there's not a link between welfare changes and food bank use. Oxfam doesn't do direct delivery. We work with partners. We are partnered with the Trussell Trust, and they're very clear. I know they've given evidence previously, but I think since then they've released figures showing that 77,000 Scots used their services last year. And one of in fact, the top reason for that was welfare delays. Yes, low income came into it, but third was welfare changes. So 2 out of the top 3 were related to welfare. Alongside that, though, we also work with the independent food bank service, the Western Bartonshire Community Food Share. They operate 3 outlets across the area, and the story they tell is remarkably similar. Their new stats for last year showing 2,500 service users went through their doors last year, and we have to pause and give credit to the volunteers who are manning these services as well. What we can clearly say, though, is that the value, the protection afforded by the welfare state has been degraded in recent years. People are being faced with a double whammy of their cash benefits losing real terms value, and alongside that, shifts in welfare entitlement. Now, some of that has been mitigated by measures in Scotland, but I don't think we can say all of it has been. So yes, I think there is a link between welfare reform and the surge in food bank use.
And Jamie, you mentioned there's 77,000 Scots haven't used the Trussell Trust in the last financial year. And obviously, they don't operate every food bank in Scotland. I don't know if you have any information as to, I mean, it would seem likely then that the figure will be much higher. I don't know if you have any information about that.
We don't. Clearly, there are a lot of independent food banks, food shares, services across the country. I think what was shown up in the recent report, I think it was done by Spice, showed that the trends that we're seeing in the Trussell Trust are pretty much replicated across other food bank services across the country. So in terms of numbers, no, I don't have those, but in terms of the reasons for people turning up at food banks, I think what the Trussell Trust are seeing pretty much is replicated elsewhere.
Okay. Dave Kilgour and then Kevin Stewart.
In Aberdeen City.
Sorry, that'll come on for you.
In Aberdeen City, we're supporting the Food Bank Partnership, which brings together a number of organisations that have been kind of doing food bank work for many years. Community Food Initiatives North East, Instant Neighbour Trust, also linked in with a whole lot of community-based organisations, community projects. We support them through direct funding through the Council's Fairer Aberdeen Fund. The figures they had for last year was 7,800 beneficiaries. That's obviously individuals and families. Essentially, I would say there's obviously a link between the two things in terms of welfare reform and the growth and increase. I think basically the whole approach that needs to kind of take on board how we work in partnership, not just in supplying food, but also the whole range of other services that need to come in and provide, whether it's the other aspects of welfare reform that need to be addressed.
Thanks, Dave. Kevin. Sorry.
Thank you, Convener. Like others, I've been visiting food banks in my own area to get a grasp of what's actually happening out there. One of the things which has been bothering me of late is the amount of reports where folk are going to food banks and are unable to take certain foods because they no longer have cooking facilities and often only have access to boiling water, a kettle or something like that. So that restricts the food that they can actually get, cuts out almost all of the fresh vegetables and not necessarily fresh fruit. I wonder if folk could give us an indication of whether or not that's something that they're finding in the work that they're doing. And maybe Dr. Ip will give us an indication of how damaging that can be to folks' health, in particular young people's health, if they're not being fed properly.
Okay, I've got a note that you want in, Ken, but I'm just going to take answers to that point first, if that's okay. And I don't know if you want to respond to that, Dr. Ip.
Well, I mean, we all know that that fresh fruit and vegetables, freshly cooked food rather than processed food is much more beneficial to people's overall health. I mean, it does concern me that if people are relying on food banks, I mean, short term I think is probably all right, but in longer term, especially those with families with younger children, if those younger children aren't getting their supply of fresh fruit and vegetables, fresh meat, food that's freshly cooked rather than processed. That will have a longer term impact, I think, on the young people's health. Food isn't just about getting stuff in the bellies, though. Food also often is part of getting together with the family. If there's a social interaction with eating. And unfortunately, I think over the years, especially in families that are suffering financial stress, that sort of pastoral and well-being role that food and meals sitting together, that's been damaged. And I think young people growing up in these families who see food really as not the social and the situation that gives people sort of strength and support. I think in the longer term that's very damaging.
Kay McIntosh, you want to come in?
From a South Lanarkshire perspective, and I suppose this is really from the perspective of a number of agencies in South Lanarkshire. We have a food poverty subgroup of our financial inclusion network in South Lanarkshire who have helped prepare our evidence statement. And it's very clear from them that they're seeing an increasing number of folk who are presenting at food banks and other agencies not actually able to use your normal food parcel because they can't pay their electricity bill, so they can't use their cookers or whatever. And I think a lot of the food banks that are in place and the other agencies are now looking at other mechanisms of supporting individuals, adding on community cafes and other approaches that might help. And I think certainly similar to what Dave was saying earlier, from a kind of council perspective and also a community planning perspective, we need to think about, how we get that kind of wider type of support to those families. There are a whole number of kind of intensive family support projects that we can refer people to, and we need to be making these linkages between people presenting for assistance and going beyond simply giving crisis food aid.
Mark, did you?
Agree very strongly with the points made by Dr. Ip and by Kay McIntosh. I was recently speaking to a family support service manager in West Scotland who was saying that for them, one of the issues is that service users can't afford the public transport to come to the food bank. Therefore, Barnardo staff have to take the food or vouchers to them. And equally so there's a problem about the cost of transport, the cost of electricity, a whole basket of rising prices at a time when wage income is being depressed and benefits income is facing things like benefit sanctions and the bedroom tax. But a situation where people can't even afford the bus fare to get to the food bank is also a major challenge for making a food bank service work.
Keith?
There's a point in this that people are experiencing a crisis in their whole life and not just in the fact that they can't afford food. That's sort of at the end of a big set of coping mechanisms. They might be skipping meals, they might be living without electricity, and by the time they get to a bureau or to a food bank, they're often desperate and in a crisis. And so we absolutely see those cases where people can't afford to go get the food or they can't afford to eat the food. And I know that there are some food banks that have specific food parcels that are for people that can't afford to cook it. But taking on your point, that because there's a wide range of crisis issues, there has to be a wide range of responses to that. So it can't just be the short term. So everybody that's identified in this crisis situation has to be able to access every service that would benefit them. So they should go to one place and have access to all of them. And one of the things that we're doing is trying to build the resilience of our clients. Stirling, Citizens Vice Bureau, developed a crisis guide. So anybody in a crisis had a poster on the window. These are the things you can do, the places you can access at night and so on, and a guide they can take away, and it shows them everywhere in Stirling that they can go for help. So we're funding, I think, 23 Bureau to do the same. So it's trying to empower people to make sure they know about the support that's out there. But obviously addressing the key causes is much more important, but building resilience to people's crisis situations is really important too.
I've got Barbara, then Kevin, and I've got Ken, who's been waiting very patiently.
Thank you. From Salvation Army perspective, food banks per se are not something that we operate, but we are at the coalface of providing emergency food parcels for folks who present at our church centres and other centres as well. Going back to the initial point about whether there is a link, we have very raw data at the moment. We obviously recognise over a number of years that we've been providing this service to folks in the community who are vulnerable and particularly deprived, that there has been a major increase. So we've looked at ways to try to capture that data, and that hasn't been happening for very long, but the data that we have would suggest that the key reasons that people do present for food and emergency supplies of food are welfare reform or benefit related in terms of changes in their benefits or delays in their benefits. And the new paperwork that we're now working with actually gives an opportunity for our volunteers to record whether it's particular sanctions that have caused that difficulty and people coming for food. In terms of the Salvation Army's approach, we offer quite a holistic approach. So some of the things that folks have been saying about folks unable to heat food, etc., a number of our centres actually provide hot meals and community cafes, situations such as that, so that folks have another option. In addition to receiving an emergency food parcel, there's an opportunity to sit down, have that social interaction for folks to get to know them a bit better, perhaps point them towards other services, signpost them to other agencies that might be able to help with other needs that are contributing to the fact that they're in food poverty as well. So certainly from our perspective there has been an increase, and the changes in the benefits appear to, from the brief snapshot of evidence that we have, to have contributed to that.
For that, Barbara, Kevin, is it still in the same area?
Convener, and obviously food banks are now providing other services too. And recently, when I visited Seafine, which was just a few weeks ago, talking to one of the women who works there, who's worked in communities, deprived communities for over 35 years, she says this is the worst that she has ever seen things. And one of the shocking things, which I'd never really thought about till that day, was the help that they were now providing in terms of nappies. Where folks could not afford nappies, and of course in a lot of circumstances again couldn't use reusable nappies because they didn't have the ability to wash them. I just wonder if folks are finding that these kind of services are also being bolted on to the food provision that food banks are providing, and if so, how much of the efforts made by food banks are in these areas now?
Can folk bear that in mind? I'm going to bring in Ken because he has waited for quite a while. So,
thank you. I had a brief follow-up, but actually it was a different...
that's okay, that's fine.
Okay. Well, the brief follow-up was to Jamie Livingston's point about Oxfam's got experience of international comparisons and the use of food banks. And you might not have the statistics today, but I think the committee would appreciate any information about either lessons we can learn or similar patterns that have emerged in other countries. Our own colleague Linda Fabiani is visiting food banks in America, I think, as part of a recent trip. But I think it's always informative just to know whether or not our experience is unique here in the UK, or whether or not this is widespread in other, particularly developed countries. I mean, not just developing. And the second question is actually really it's about. This is I think there's nobody around the table, well, perhaps one exception, who is conscious that the UK government needs to respond to and change the welfare reforms. But there are many actions that we could take here in Scotland too. And I just want to ask if it's really about the appropriateness of food banks as the response to the difficulties people have. I mean, it's impossible not to be full of admiration and support for those who provide food, and people clearly need it. But many observers have said that it would be better to give cash, to give money. If people are in need, it would be better to give them money so that they could make their own choices. I noticed, Barbara Kendall, in the Salvation Army's document, you actually point out that many local authorities who are responsible for administering the crisis support through the Scottish Government only offer in-kind assistance. And I think also Mark Ballard from Bernardo has pointed out that the welfare fund and the crisis support that is available is not as instantaneously available as food banks are. So I was just wondering if there are some lessons we could learn. Food banks clearly have been a fantastic reaction to the need that exists. But I wonder if there's a more appropriate way of responding, providing money, providing cash, which might actually boost the resilience and give people a bit more respect, actually, than providing them food parcels.
Jamie, do you want to respond to the first point about international comparisons?
We're certainly, Scotland and the UK is certainly not alone in this. I mean, around the world we're facing a situation where 1 in 8 people are going hungry. And over the last 20 years we have seen a dramatic increase in the amount of food aid being distributed in developed countries. But how food poverty is defined and recorded is dramatically different between different contexts. What I would say is what we would learn from Oxfam's humanitarian response is that cash is actually a very useful way of trying to deal with this. And you picked up a little bit on that in your second point there. If you give cash instead of food, it not only gives people choice, it gives people dignity, but it also boosts the local economy. People who are going for food support will spend any money that they get in the local economy and boost the local economy. So I think from our programme experience, cash rather than food would be our preferable choice. More broadly than that, though, I would just say this isn't a matter of affordability in terms of welfare. What we spend as a percentage of GDP on welfare now is pretty much the same as what it was 20 years ago. And we're living in a country right now where 5 of the richest families own the same wealth as 20% of the poorest people in the UK. That's more than 12 million people. So it comes down to choices, political will, but I don't think it comes down to whether or not we can or can't afford to give people enough money to live, whether they're in work or out of work, with the dignity to which we're all entitled.
Kay, you'd indicated you wanted to come in.
It was really just sort of coming back on your point, Ken, about the Scottish Welfare Fund and its place as well and its ability to pay cash, and certainly from a South Lanarkshire Council level. And I know there is variance across the country in terms of the Scottish Welfare Fund, but I mean, I think we're sitting at 97% of the fund spent with applications still being processed. We do try and turn around applications within a day as opposed to the 2 days. This is for crisis loans, obviously, as our crisis payment, should I say, as opposed to community care grants. And we will pay cash when it's somebody that can't feed themselves. We'll certainly pay cash to them. But I know there is variance across the country, and I think we have to try and make the systems around the Scottish Welfare Fund as appropriate as possible to people's needs. But it's also working out when is that route appropriate as opposed to a food bank route. And, you know, I think, again, that's where it comes back to us working as community planning partnerships and working out appropriate referral routes and also the additional supports that we mentioned earlier.
I think everybody would recognise that food banks have been incredibly effective at meeting the needs of families at the moment when they're in crisis. And those were the comments that I made on behalf of Bernardo's in terms of our response, that the ability for our workers to go to a family, discover that there's no food in the house and be able to offer an instant solution to the problem of there being no food in the house at that moment means that food banks have been incredibly valuable. But Ken McIntosh is quite right to highlight that that food banks are not an answer to the long-term problem of child poverty in Scotland and the rest of the UK. And in terms of the point about cash, I would highlight, for example, the impact of the decision to suppress the uprating of benefits, which will mean that benefits, tax credits will continue to fall behind the increase in the cost of things like food and fuel and transport. And if we need to give people, I would suggest that if we need to support people financially, this should be done through a welfare state which is adequate to meet the basic needs, particularly of families with vulnerable children. And so that would be my answer to the question about giving people cash. Yes, but that should be through a welfare system that meets people's needs. The committee discussed, and I was part of the discussion of the sanctions regime, and tackling a punitive and often illogical sanctions regime is part of ensuring people have got the cash that they need to support themselves while they move from one job to another.
Keith, did you indicate you want to come in here?
Yeah, I think ultimately a lack of cash is the root cause of the problem, whether it's a reduction in benefits, the removal of benefits, or a gap in payment. It all means that people don't have enough income to actually buy food or to meet their outgoings. So that logically leads to that being part of the solution. And as Mark's saying, we do need to have a proper benefit safety net to make sure that everybody does have cash. I think before this crisis, I think people were just existing above this crisis level, but we're getting people dipping down because of that lack of income. And the trick is to raise those people out of the crisis that they're in. And it's not just benefit recipients as well, it's people in employment, in low-paid employment. I think the majority of people in relative poverty are in work or have at least one adult in work, so it's about looking at their income as well and making sure that they don't slide into crisis. So while I'm really thankful that food banks have done the work that they have, and thank goodness they have, the long term has to look at people's income and whether the benefit system actually supports people or not.
Annabelle, was it in this area? Is it a different area?
Well, picking up on some points, but perhaps broadening it out a wee bit. On the discussion on payments in kind and cash payments, the committee actually had a very interesting evidence session some weeks ago now with those involved on the front line as far as the Scottish Welfare Fund is concerned. And I think, from memory, certainly the majority view appeared to be that they wish to have the flexibility to make in-kind payments, but obviously it's an issue that the committee will be looking at in its broader consideration of the legislation to come forth. On the debate that we're having, I mean, I wonder what the experience of the practitioners here today is of the DWP hardship payment system. Are these actually being made available to people or not? You know, it would be interesting for the committee to hear your first-hand experience of that. And then picking up on the issue of sanctions, which has been mentioned by many of you as having an impact on people's health, as Dr. Ip said, and indeed a deleterious impact on people's situations and the increased recourse to food banks. Mark Ballard described the sanction system as punitive and often illogical. For example, in CAS's submission today, they highlight one of the action points as being the need to make urgent reforms to the sanction regime and improving DWP administration. So I just wonder what kind of practical, we are having a session with the DWP after this, and what kind of practical suggestions would you make to, with a view to improving the sanctions regime, which we can see is having such a very, very negative impact on people's lives? Sorry, Chair, for having broadened things out to me.
Okay.
Just to respond to that, we find that the majority of people we see, or certainly a significantly high number of people that receive a sanction, aren't aware that they have. They just go to the bank and they have no money, and then they come to the Bureau, and it's up to the Bureau to find out. And then they have no idea of the support that's out there, you know, about hardship payments, how to appeal, how to go to mandatory reconsideration. So there's a huge lack of information to claimants, so that they don't understand why they've been sanctioned, they don't know even that they have. So there's a big lack of information. We do think that where a sanction is applied, people have to be given notice. There's a case in our briefing where a person found out on the day she was supposed to get her payment, and not many of us could survive a break in payment when we just found out on that day that we didn't get what we were expecting. And we also think that people should get at least one written warning to say you would have been sanctioned, but so they can actually learn from their mistakes. So these are very easy administrative changes that would actually help people build resilience and actually make the sanctions regime actually work, so people do get warning and can change their behaviour. But at the moment there's a significant lack of information, and people really don't understand why they have no money in their account.
Sanctions are clearly on the DWP's agenda. We had the Oakley review come back. Oxfam welcomed the Oakley review, but we thought it was probably too narrow. And we're probably at the stage now where we think there's problems with sanctions being misapplied. There's problems with them not leading to the intended outcomes. We need to look at the decision-making around when sanctions are applied, what level of sanctions are applied, and how sanctions are communicated. And the Oakley review only really looked at the communication of sanctions rather than actually how the system is working. Alongside that, it's important to realise that when sanctions are applied, we're looking at an overturn rate of around 58%. So it's not as if the sanctions regime is particularly effective at this stage. And one other thing that I would say is that in terms of trying to influence that debate, clearly there's currently an all-party parliamentary group being set up on food poverty at Westminster, but on that there's not a Scottish MP, and currently, to the best of my knowledge, there's not a visit to Scotland on the timetable for that group. So certainly this committee, I think, could have a role in feeding back some of these concerns to the APPG.
Thanks, Jimmy. That's a helpful suggestion. Alec, you've been waiting to come in.
What I wanted to ask was, it goes back to something that was in Bernardo's written evidence, and which Mark mentioned in his opening remarks, and that was that one of the drivers of food poverty is, of course, the increase in cost of food. Now, I don't think you got any support from that around the table, and I wondered if there was anybody around the table had a specific view on the cost of food, general cost of living, but specifically the cost of food in relation to the increase in demand for food banks.
Mark, yeah.
On that specific point, and I'm glad Alex Johnson has raised this, I think it's not, the issue is not the rising cost of food prices, it's that the cost of food and other basic living costs has
energy as well.
And energy, transport, has not matched the increase in wages, and, as I mentioned, the fact that benefits will not be uprated from 2013 to 2015 means that benefits will also be falling in real terms. So the reason why there's an issue about the cost of living is because of declining real wages coming out of the recession. It's because of declining benefits, and that's why this is one of the contributory factors. But it's not fuel price or transport or food price inflation on its own. It's the fact that an increasingly insecure low-wage economy with increasing costs of basic goods creates a very difficult situation for vulnerable families, especially when the benefits, which supported, as Keith Dybra said, support as many people in work as people out of work, are also being depressed.
In terms of the specifics from an Aberdeen city perspective, I think the high cost of living in a city like Aberdeen is a factor in terms of how food banks are now being used by people who are actually in work, and certainly that's some of the information I've had back from the Food Bank Partnership. Aspects like the lack of available housing at a low cost within the city means that particularly the private sector, rented sector, is leading to people having to be much more reliant on things like food banks or whatever, basically, to get by. So I would say there is an element in terms of the cost of living. Aberdeen is a city that's got a huge gap between wealth and poor, and really the whole kind of minimum wage, living wage is an issue for the city. And in fact, I mean, there is some discussion about whether Aberdeen should actually have an Aberdeen waiting allowance or an Aberdeen living wage that actually reflects the actual local economy itself.
Annabelle, were you looking to come back in?
No, Dr. Ip was seeking to...
Okay.
It's just from a GP perspective. I mean, just coming back to sanctions, we see a lot of people in crisis because of benefit sanctions. I mean, examples, from my own practice, is a lady who was on job seekers allowance and couldn't sign on because she was in a job interview, and had told the Job Centre Plus staff that she had an interview that day. I think it was a Thursday. She was due to sign on, but couldn't sign on because she was at a job interview. But the response was very, very hard line, saying, if you don't sign on, if you don't attend the job centre, then you'll be sanctioned. So, I think she ended up going to the job interview because she was minded to apply for that job. But that caused a great deal of stress for her, and she ended up being sanctioned. And that's an example of how people who are actually following the rules, trying their best, but the system's working against them. And those that have some resilience can cope, but those that don't, a small event like that can tip them over, and it's hugely damaging. And GPs see that, and in the long term, these people who are trying their best for themselves could actually be sort of tipped into a stress-related illness because of these, this type of decision.
Thank you for that, Dr. It's probably an appropriate moment to ask you, because one of the reasons we were keen to have you along today was an issue that you had been quoted in the press as expressing concern about GPs being required to refer their patients to food banks. And I've seen the Spice briefing we've been provided that the GP magazine Pulse, which is not a publication I'm particularly aware of, surveyed over 500 GPs and found that 16% have been asked to refer patients to food banks. And also I note that at the annual conference of representatives of Scottish local medical committees, there was a resolution passed about this issue as well. And that's interesting, because at our last session on food banks, I explicitly asked the question of the food bank providers there, do they have such a requirement? And not a single one of them said they did have such a requirement. So I'm just, that evidence doesn't tally with your experience. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about your experience and where this is particularly an issue.
Yeah, having asked GPs both locally in my area and also GPs in Scotland, the experience of GPs is very variable. There are some experiences which aren't so positive, that GPs in practices find that, for example, a local food bank has experienced significant pressure on their services, and as one of the ways of dealing with that is to ask people that they'll need a referral from a health professional, and it's usually a GP, to access their services. And I think that's a sign of those services actually becoming under pressure themselves, and not being able to meet the demand for food services. But there are other areas that I think are quite positive, where, for example, in Rutherglen, when the new food bank opened there, they proactively engaged the local GP community in promoting their services and actually informing the GPs of what they're offering. And the GP forum in Rutherglen were hugely supportive and actually identified a lot of the issues that we're talking about here today. Your GPs, see a wide variety of people, and a lot of the people that we see are very vulnerable and are, as I say, often in crisis. GPs do want to be involved in helping people. Food banks is one way that we can help sort of signpost people. But I think what I would say is that the experience of general practice is very variable. And I think that probably is a sign that this explosion, I think, in food bank provision has happened over a relatively short time. In some areas, the information going out to GPs and patients is good, but in some areas, because of just the rapid expansion, things haven't been so well connected with the health sector.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I was just going to pick up on your point, Dr. Rip, about GPs being asked to meet referrals. And I think my understanding, certainly in South Lanarkshire, and you talked about Rutherglen and Cambuslang Food Bank, which they're doing a fantastic job. But my understanding is most of the food banks, certainly in our area, do require a referral. It's a way of managing their system, and also I think it's around recording some data as well, which they're trying to do more of now as well. But it doesn't have to be a doctor. It could be a social worker. It could be a health visitor. Really anybody else that is working and supporting that individual. So I think it's just highlighting it's not about it having to be a doctor. You're just one of a number of professionals asked to refer folk on to services.
Keith?
I think the experience of Citizens Advice Bureau is very similar to what Dr. was describing. 3 years ago, this would have been an unheard of situation, a client coming to you saying they hadn't eaten. But unfortunately, the explosion in the last few years has shown it's now quite a common thing. And it's quite difficult for an advisor who's more often than not a volunteer to tell somebody there's nothing I can do for you other than give you a food bank referral. So most bureau have had to urgently look what's in their local authority to try find those links, making links with food banks and Salvation Army and so on, to make sure there is somewhere that the volunteers can signpost somebody. So it's been a very difficult experience for Bureau, and because one of our membership conditions is that we're non-judgmental, we don't make decisions on referrals, on entitlement. We shouldn't have to make a decision that somebody is entitled to a food parcel. It should be the service that's offering it. So that's caused some difficulties, but though that seems to have been worked past. But it's been a difficult process for Bureau to make sure that clients are being signposted to the right place.
Yeah, I think our position would be that if a GP, in the course of seeing a patient and doing a mental physical assessment, finds that food is actually an issue, then we would want to be involved in giving the people the right advice and signposting, and actually, giving the patient a good service, with knowledge of our local services. What we don't want are people coming into the GP practice with the sole aim of actually getting a referral, because they've been to, say, a food bank and been told, actually, go back to your GP practice. I would feel that actually lengthens the patient journey. And actually, it adds workload into our practices. And, we're already very, very extremely pressed at the moment for GP appointments. Practices tell me that they're working flat out. I'm certainly working flat out when I'm in practice. So we don't want this additional step when people do present to food banks. I think when we do see that there's a need, then I think we'll be very happy to work with food banks in actually getting people the right services.
But part of the issue here, obviously, is that food banks are an informal arrangement, whereas obviously GP services, that's a part of the formal, the state, the NHS, and so on. I mean, is this part of the problem here? That how do you interact with an agency that's just telling people, that's an informal organisation, telling people to go to GPs? Do you have evidence of this as well? You're suggesting this happens. Do you have evidence that this happens, and how are you trying to deal with it where it does happen?
Well, you mentioned the survey done by the GP magazine. I don't have hard figures, but it's anecdotal evidence whereby GPs are telling me that in the morning surgery, 2 patients turned up that who were told by the food bank administrator that actually you can't self-present, you have to get a letter or get a voucher, And often if people don't know how to access services, general practice, because we're visible, we're open, we're available to patients, often we're the first port of call for a lot of people. And that's how it should be. But my concern is that, especially with the increasing numbers of food banks, is that we're increasingly seen as the first port of call then. That if you've got a food issue, go and see the GP. And, I wouldn't support that at all.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up the point really around about kind of like food banks and the proliferation of food banks. Certainly within Aberdeen, again, the people can self-refer to food banks that are operating. I know the Trussell Trust perhaps is a bit different in terms of it requires a referral process. The approach we had in Aberdeen, though, to building a food bank partnership was actually to try and work on how to establish some kind of common standards and to start developing some guidance around about how food banks should operate, how they should communicate with different services, and widening that with the whole kind of public sector. So the knowledge about the impact of welfare reform becomes a lot kind of more known in the city as a whole, and that therefore the systems of how people actually access things and when they require it becomes a lot clearer. Now, we haven't achieved within our food bank partnership that every food bank in the city is part of that, but part of the approach to having a partnership is to make sure that things like diet, nutrition, the whole kind of range of things, whether that's about money, advice, community, personal budgeting, all of these things then become part of a kind of overall approach to welfare reform. And unless we work in kind of on a community planning partnership basis around about all of those issues, you can't kind of treat food banks in complete isolation. I think one of my own issues and concerns, I suppose, about some of the proliferation of food banks is that essentially you'll see from all the kind of case studies that as a committee you've heard, a lot of the people who are presenting in front of food banks are very vulnerable people, and the actual whole situation about food banks is very kind of ad hoc. And so the people who are actually providing that kind of support, albeit it is well-meaning, but essentially it doesn't comply with other things about vulnerable people. So, I mean, maybe one of the things it needs to look at is how we actually, without getting into the bureaucracy of registration, etc., but maybe there is something the Scottish Government could do around about providing some kind of practical guidance or some method whereby what is actually a food bank is kind of recognised.
Okay. I think that point there, I think, is key. We're dealing here with what is essentially an unregulated sector. And when we hear about the food banks referring people back to GPs, that concerns me greatly, because that's a flaw in the process, if you like, for that. But you're suggesting that some kind of regulation is needed. Who should be doing that? Is it not the job of the local authority to do essentially what you're doing in Aberdeen, but to do it with a stronger hand?
I've just floated the idea. I'm not actually, I mean, I'm going to go the kind of solution as such. I just think it's an area, though, that actually needs to be looked at in terms of, well, what would that actually involve? And I don't think it's necessarily up to one local authority to impose that on the voluntary sector. I think it actually needs to be taken on board through a discussion with food banks on a kind of wider basis about, well, what would actually help the food banks themselves in terms of how they're developing, and kind of being very clear about what their purpose is and how in the kind of long term it will be part of a kind of sustained approach to supporting people who are in poverty.
There's people have indicated, I know I do want dialogue and discussion, but I want it to be fairly structured. So, Dave, you finished? Right. Jamie?
Two things. A quick point about the referral system that's worth noting is that clearly not all food banks require a referral system. Certainly the partner organisation we work with, the Western Bartonshire Community Food Share, doesn't operate a referral system. If you turn up and you need food, you will get food. I'm also a little bit uncomfortable about discussion about almost institutionalising food banks and food support. We need to be seeing food banks as a temporary solution and dealing with the root causes rather than embedding it within our response to tackling poverty. So whilst I think it's important that we support food banks and the very many volunteers around the country who, for example, answer newspaper adverts to come and support food banks, I think we need to be cautious about where we put the balance of our energies between institutionalising that response and actually tackling with the root causes in the first place.
Presumably one of their strengths as well is that they are sort of informal, community-led bodies as well. Alec, are you wanting to come back in now?
Really, I was just talking about the specific issues relating to regulation. I think getting the message from Jamie Livingston that you know, this is not something that requires general regulation. I think what we've heard very clearly is that practice is different in different local authority areas, and that to a significant extent that exists because that's required. So some form of overarching understanding is required within local government areas, but I don't think the one-size-fits-all approach is likely to be successful.
Just to pick up, Dave has you know, vastly more experience of his situation within Aberdeen. The point I was making was that the balance of our efforts should be focused on tackling the root causes of why people are going to food banks, rather than seeking to regulate and institutionalise food banks going forward.
Oh, well, I was about to go to Kevin, but a number of people want to pick up on that point, so I'll come to Kevin, Kay, then Mark.
To make a point about local authorities' roles. I mean, obviously we are working very hard to support food banks and other food poverty initiatives locally, so that we can build a stronger network, because there has to be a strong network. But I think on top of that, it's also worth noting, and I'm sure we've got it in our evidence paper as well, that from council services, particularly Money Matters, our money, debt and welfare rights advice service, you know, we're having to deal with increasing numbers of folk presenting with debt issues and requiring representation at appeals. And that takes us away from doing that preventative work, you know, that we would be like, you know, that we would far prefer to do in relation to income maximisation, also supporting people's financial capability as well. So I think it needs to be noted that, you know, the impact of, you know, increasing sanctions, benefit delays, all the things we've talked about today, are making it very hard for our council services to be able to do the work that we should be doing, which is focusing on preventative solutions.
Mark, then Dave.
And very much following on from that, as I think people of all parties, all the participants have said, a food bank is a response to a family in extreme crisis. It's hard to imagine a more severe crisis than not being able to feed your family. The Christie Commission highlighted that the way forward for public services has to be that we take demand out of the system through preventative actions and early intervention to tackle the root causes of inequality, rather than have a crisis management system. No matter how much effort people put into the crisis management, it's always going to be better to tackle the problem at the earlier stages. And I think there's an issue for some of the Barnardo's projects that we have, which are trying to deliver early intervention, but when we turn up to deliver an early intervention and discover that actually the primary concern of the parents is how they're going to put food on the table tonight, anything we're doing about parenting support has to wait until you've solved that problem. And that's not a good use of an early intervention service, that it actually becomes crisis management. And that's why food banks can't be anything more than a short-term crisis management. We need long-term interventions, as Jamie Livingston described, that actually tackle inequality. And the final thing on this is in terms of what a good service looks like. When I was giving evidence in terms of the sanctions regime, I highlighted some of the evidence from our homelessness service in North Lanarkshire, working particularly with young people in the care system who are now homeless, who need support to get them out of that crisis into settled accommodation. My understanding from talking to our service in North Lanarkshire is that being a young homeless care leaver does not automatically mean you don't get sanctioned. Sanctioning a homeless care leaver is punitive and illogical in the extreme. It makes no sense in terms of what should be a proper path of getting that young person settled into appropriate accommodation and then able to deal with whatever has led them to that situation. Sanctioning them is not an appropriate response and does nothing to help supporting that young person into a positive pathway.
Thanks, Mark. Dave?
I just wanted to agree with Jamie in terms of obviously prevention is the best approach long term. I think what I was trying to address though is the fact that we've got a situation where we have got this proliferation of food banks who are part of alleviating poverty at the moment, and that really the wee concern that I have is run about the kind of vulnerable people and making sure that the services that they're providing and the people who are often working in food banks, and I know from some of the ones in Aberdeen, some of the actual people who are volunteering are vulnerable people themselves, that actually there needs to be a kind of look at that in terms of, well, how do you actually make sure that the overall situation for the organisations and for the individuals using them is protected.
Thank you. Kevin?
I think the preventative measures are key, but unfortunately we are where we are. And I think one of the things that we're not very good at sometimes is exporting best practice from one part of the country to the other. Now, from my experience in terms of Aberdeen and the partnership that has been formed, many of the folks who are working in food banks, not as volunteers but as workers, are pretty experienced community workers who have been on the ground for a very long time. Now, at the right point, they are signposting folk to money advice services and other ways of getting them out of the cycle. And I think if that is going on right across the country, that's a very good thing. If it's not, then that's something that we need to explore around the country. And I think in terms of probably our ongoing work, convener, we should continue to look at how various parts of the country are developing and trying to link services to create solutions rather than just trying to fix crisis after crisis after crisis.
So we'll consider our report, Kevin. That's something we can think about. And I don't know if anyone wants to respond to Kevin's point about exporting best practice, if this is something that you feel you as organisations can be involved in, or because I know obviously a number of you are operating across the country. Keith?
I think something's been clear is that it's been a community response and a bottom-up rather than a top-down response, and it's been fantastic because it's local organisations coming together like FoodShare to design a system that works for local people in the local community. And I think it is absolutely worthwhile to do research to actually find out what's happening across the country, because I think there are some very innovative and fantastic responses going on, and I think it would be really interesting and useful to find out what they are and see if they're applicable in a wider sense or in different areas. So I think there's a knowledge gap to know what they actually are, but I'm aware of Bureau being involved in multiple ones across the country that are having great effects locally, so it's worth looking at whether that can be applied elsewhere.
In terms of solutions to the problem, I remain concerned that the solutions are still a long way off. I say that because there was a recent report from the Deep End Group that reviewed their March the 12th a report on the effects of the benefits reforms. The first report came out in March 12 and it was reviewed in September 13. And in September 13, just a few months ago, they were very concerned that things had got significantly worse since March the 12th when the first report came out. And that's in terms of the welfare changes and the benefit sanctions from the 2007 Act. But the 2012 Act, with regards to the housing benefit changes and also what will happen to universal credit, PIP changes, that is still in the pipeline at the moment, and as GPs and certainly speaking for GPs in very deprived practices, we are concerned that actually food banks, although a very good thing, is firefighting, and the fire is still raging on, and unless the system as a whole is more focused on our patients and their helping people with the finances and navigating the whole sort of complex system. I don't see that things will change soon.
Thank you. Ken.
Yes, it's just again, the subject of how we respond, and in particular how the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament should respond to this crisis. I think Keith just talked about the fact that food banks are a fantastic community response, and the Scottish Government has been very good in just providing £1 million to support food banks. But part of the welfare reform process has been to devolve responsibility for many of the welfare systems to local authorities and to the Scottish Government, so crisis funds and housing benefit being the main ones. Our main political reaction has been to try to persuade the UK Government that it's got it wrong, and I think that will remain our main intent. But an alternative, clearly, is for the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to decide to support our local authorities to intervene, to make up the difference. That's what we did with the bedroom tax. Would it be appropriate for us to make up the shortfall, basically, in the sanctions and the financial hardship that's being imposed on people by providing far greater financial support through our local authorities, far greater money to people in that sense? Or would it be, would that actually be, I think in the words of John Swinney, letting the UK Government off the hook? It's a big question, that one.
Annabelle wants to be the first to respond to that.
So Annabelle's not the person.
No,
Annabelle was the first to indicate.
I was going to say, Ken, perhaps whilst our panellists are composing the responses to your question, I might just add a few comments about that, but also something else I wish to raise. Obviously, it would be fantastic if you could mitigate everything coming from Westminster, but I mean, the fact of the matter is that you simply can't financially mitigate all the impacts of welfare reform. The solution, of course, is to take control in this Parliament over welfare. Ken mentioned the fact that there are a few issues that we can deal with, but most of the issues that we're hearing today we can't deal with because we don't have the power. I would argue let's get the power and do something about it, and we would make a much better job of it than the successive Westminster Government. Of course, if you take out of a fixed budget money for something, you're taking it from another budget. So I don't know which budget, for example, has to be... Pardon me?
Taking money out of prevention, probably.
Well, of prevention, which is preventative spend, which we've heard is a very important spend indeed. So whilst the panellists are thinking about that issue, the other issue I wanted to raise was, of course, the impact on children. And in terms of the figures that we have for food bank recourse from the Trussell Trust, we saw that in the last year, 2013-14, the number of people having recourse to their food banks involved 22,387 children. I find that figure absolutely astonishing and appalling. And I wanted to make 2 points. One is, are these children on somebody's radar? I assume that that is the case through the various processes involving local authority and health service, but are they on somebody's radar? And how is it that the arm of state, the DWP, can sanction, in effect, children? How can they take take food out of the mouths of children, which is what they're doing when they sanction the adult? How can they deal with children in that way? Is that not just a breach of children's rights under the UN Children's Charter, amongst other things? How can that happen in the 21st century? So I get really annoyed when I think of these issues. But that was the key point I wish to raise, Chairman.
Do people want to respond to both these points from Ken and Annabelle? Keith?
I'm not going to get into independence debate, otherwise I get in trouble, I guess. But I do think the Scottish Government has had some success in mitigating the impact of welfare reforms, the extra funding through council tax reduction, the Scottish Welfare Funds, the bedroom tax has had an impact, and I think things would be worse in Scotland had they not done that. But there is the issue that actually the policy is wrong, so actually spending money towards a policy that is causing this problem in the first place. It's not the most efficient way of doing things. So I don't think you can ever mitigate completely, but there is a role for the Scottish Government in that. In terms of the children aspect, our figures show that the majority of people that need food parcels are single men with no caring responsibilities, but there are a significant minority. I think our figures say 23% of people that are needing, 27%, sorry, of people that need child support have dependent children. So that is a significant minority, and you're absolutely right. When people get sanctioned, their children aren't, a mitigating factor for that. They still get sanctioned. So that is a significant concern that there are families out there where the children are paying the price of, either a policy or something that their parents may or may not have done.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I was just going to make the point really about your point about, these children on the radar. And it probably comes back to Dave's point about, you've got groups of volunteers supporting individuals and very vulnerable individuals, and sometimes the volunteers are very vulnerable as well. In terms of our voluntary sector and all the partners in South Lanarkshire, I think we're all very well connected to getting it right for every child. So certainly, our partners will know that if there is a child involved, what to do and how to make sure that those that should know do know. I don't think I would be able to say at the moment with any confidence that every food bank volunteer would have that knowledge. And I think, again, it's going back to Dave's point, and it's not about trying to, bring in so much bureaucracy, but it is being aware of the fact that very vulnerable people are using those services, and we then need to make sure that the people that are operating those services have the skills and abilities to at least make sure that they're referring folk onto the right services. And just to say, I think similar to what Cass are saying, certainly in South Lanarkshire, the majority of folk, I think we've got 51% of folk using food banks are single, mainly men, with no caring responsibilities. However, I know from a couple of the food banks, because not all of them are breaking down their data yet, but 24% are single parents and 13% parents. So if you add that together, what's that? It's nearly 40%. So actually it's still a very large number.
I think the first thing to say is that food banks are a crisis response, and they're therefore used by families who may be doing quite well, think that they're surviving, and then it's a sudden sanction, benefit delay, issue with a payday loan that tips them into crisis. And so these may well not be families who had any requirement to be identified by social services or anybody else until the point where suddenly they're in an unexpected crisis. And I think that does provide a huge challenge for the new system, which the GERFEC, statutory GERFEC system that's going to come in with the Children and Young People Act, in terms of making that work, because that gives responsibilities to public bodies for the well-being of children. A child cannot, as Annabel Ewing very passionately pointed out, have well-being if its parents are reliant on food parcels to feed it. So I think there's a big issue in terms of where those responsibilities overlap, and it does, again, come down to the minutiae of the Scotland Act in terms of when local authorities have responsibility towards the well-being of children, but the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament and local authorities do not have any responsibilities for the general benefit system. So I think there's a complicated set of things that need to be unpicked about the responsibilities. But if local authorities and health boards are going to make good their responsibility for the well-being of all children in their area under the Children and Young People Act, then they will have to address the needs of children who are made vulnerable by parents in crisis, whether that's from a benefit delay, a benefit sanction, or indeed from bedroom tax causing problems in terms of covering payments of accommodation.
Jamie's want to come in. Just before you do, Jamie, because I've wanted, and I might as well raise it now, seeing as you've indicated you want to come in. In your report, you highlighted your previous, your mission. You highlighted the report you'd made previously, Walking the Breadline, which had a number of recommendations, such as the House of Commons Working Pension Select Committee conducting an urgent parliamentary inquiry into the relationship between benefit delay, error or sanctions, welfare reform changes and the growth of food poverty. The DWP should publish data on number of and type of households are deprived of their benefits by reason of benefit delay, error or sanctions, and they should also commission independent monitoring of the rollout of universal credit to ensure there is no unintentional increase in food poverty. I know you wanted to respond to some of the discussion previously, but can you tell us how you've got on pushing these organisations?
Well, certainly the all-party parliamentary group is one response to the Walking the Breadline report, and I would watch this space on a follow-up to Walking the Breadline shortly. What I would say is that, to go back to Ken McIntosh's point, is that we have to respond to the crisis, and we shouldn't argue over where the money is coming from. The money needs to be put in place to ensure that people have food when they need it. That's the bottom line. Now, the Scottish Government have taken some very welcome mitigation measures, whether that's the Emergency Food Aid Action Plan, the bedroom tax, the Scottish Welfare Fund. That's all great, but it's mitigating a problem, and we need to also turn a spotlight, and this committee has a role in that as well, on where the root causes of the problem are coming from. Alongside that, though, there are measures that the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government can take in terms of trying to tackle some of the underlying problems, for example, about in-work poverty and decent work, through encouraging the move from minimum wage to living wage through, for example, the procurement bill. We can also recognise the fact that poverty isn't just about a shortage of money, it's also about a shortage of power and influence. And we certainly have been campaigning for the creation of a poverty commissioner in Scotland to put a pro-poor lens over all decision-making that this place makes. More broadly than that, though, we've just come through a major financial crisis, and Oxfam's work internationally suggests that when we are responding to crises, we don't simply try to rebuild a model that wasn't particularly effective or resilient in the first place. We need to build back better. And the model that we seem intent on building back towards is one that has poverty still at its core. Prior to the financial crisis, we had around 1 in 5 people across the UK in poverty, and we seem to be wanting to go straight back to that same model. We need to do better than that. We need to broaden our horizons beyond a narrow focus on GDP and whether economic growth goes up or down, to actually look at the quality of that economic growth and who benefits from it. And that may well, yes, involve a look at things like progressive taxation and rebalancing the UK's books, not on the poorest, most vulnerable people as we're doing now, but actually on those who are more than capable of paying their share. So, yes, the Scottish Parliament has a role in terms of doing whatever it can to mitigate the worst impact of hunger in Scotland, but we need to go beyond that and actually look at the root causes, both within our control here in Scotland and across the UK. And go back to Cassie's point, Oxfam doesn't take a view on the Constitution, but we do have a view on poverty and inequality. And regardless of where the levers are sitting, we need to do better.
Okay. We're sort of scheduled to finish about now for this session. I'm afraid I'm sure we could go on a lot longer. So can I thank witnesses for coming along today and giving the benefit of their experience and their thoughts on this subject matter. The committee will consider its next steps later on this session. I'm going to suspend the meeting till about 11:25. Okay, folks, the convener has sent a message to say unfortunately he's not going to be able to make the meeting at all, so you're stuck with me for the entire session today. So we come to agenda item 3, benefit sanctions session with the DWP. In February, the committee issued an invitation to the Minister of State for Employment to provide formal evidence on the topic of benefit sanctions at today's meeting. I think they speak for almost all of the committee when I say that we're very disappointed that this invitation was declined by Esther McVeigh, and the committee is hoping to confirm arrangements for an informal meeting with the Minister before the summer recess. Formal evidence from the DWP is a vital part of our scrutiny of benefit sanctions. We have therefore accepted the offer for a senior official to attend to provide evidence today, and on that basis I wish to welcome Neil Cooling, Work Services Director from the DWP, along today, and I understand you have an opening statement. Mr Cooling, is that correct?
I just thought, Deputy Convener, I just thought I might pick up on a few things that were said in your previous evidence hearing, and also draw the committee's attention to the memorandum the Department submitted. For reasons outside of my control, I think it came to your clerk a bit late, for which apologies around that, but it did leave my office on time. So we're investigating why that happened, but apologies to everybody for that. And I was thinking, as Jamie Livingston was speaking, sort of summing up his last question, just how much the Department for Work and Pensions agrees with him, in that clearly, we do need to tackle the issues of poverty. But one of the most effective ways of tackling poverty is about getting people into jobs. And what you've got before you, I know you've heard a lot of evidence that has sort of suggested that the regime isn't working or is pointless. Some of your contributors have said. Actually, it's not out of line with what other countries do. The UK has a strong reputation in terms of its ability to implement policies such as we are delivering, with some great results. And you're seeing employment rising in Scotland, you're seeing unemployment falling, you're seeing the number of people on workless benefits falling as well. And we think it's the policy mix and the operational delivery on the ground, our people in job centres who are doing a fantastic job day in, day out, that's achieving these positive outcomes for Scotland. So, as I say, I don't know if you've had a chance to read the memorandum, but the memorandum tries to put out the academic case for what we're doing and give you a real evidence base rather than some of the anecdote you've been getting, just about why do other countries adopt active benefit regimes, why the UK has such an approach, and just the successes that flow from that.
Okay, thank you for that. In your memorandum, you say it's a mistake to see sanctions as a punitive measure. Do you think benefit recipients see it that way?
Do benefit recipients see it that way? I don't know. My experience is that many benefit recipients welcome the jolt that the sanction can give to them. And indeed, I've got evidence I can share with the committee, if it wants, of some very positive outcomes coming from just those kind of tough conversations. And they're tough conversations to have on the job centre side, as well as for the claimants to be part of as well. So, some people will no doubt react very badly to being sanctioned, and we see some very strong reactions to that. But others recognise that it's the wake-up call they needed, and helps them get back on, into work.
Job centres across the country have been inundated with thank you cards.
Yes, it's not unremarkable.
Oh, well, that's probably certainly a surprise to me. I don't know about colleagues around the table. In your memorandum, you talk about some job seekers not responding as positively, and you've talked about that there. You say psychologically they withdrawn to dependency and denial. Attitudes abound, such as there are no jobs, I don't have the skills, I'm happy on benefits, are a defensive psychological response brought on by the unsettling circumstances. I'm just wondering who had the degree in psychology to come up with this assessment.
Well, we've done an awful amount of work, both academically, but also we employ psychologists as well in our job centres. And I think there's very often judgments are made about people's kind of motivations. You know, they're kind of moral judgments made. There's certainly none I've never made myself. You hear language about people being feckless, scroungers and the like. That's not the language that the Department for Work and Pensions uses. Becoming unemployed can be a very traumatic thing to happen in somebody's lives, and people respond to that trauma in different kinds of ways. Some people remain positive, as I say in the memorandum, and some people withdraw. So the system can't just rely on one approach or two approaches. It needs to be multifaceted. We need different approaches, and that's what advisors in job centres are doing. And sanctions are part of that, but they're not the only thing that job centres are doing. And I think some of the impressions you might be left with you know, from some of the evidence you've heard, is that all job centres are doing is applying sanctions. Now, that just is not the case. And in fact, if you turn to in the memorandum to the attitudinal group analysis at paragraph 10, you'll see that what people are actually responding, how active they are in their job search, it is only a very small minority of people, less than 1/5, who are actively seeking work. And to get a job, you have to be looking for one. So the system tries to calibrate a set of responses to moving more people in that group. And that's why we've been getting success in the last few years in terms of falls of people on benefit and numbers of unemployment falling, because we're managing to encourage, support and move people through these different attitudinal groups into that determined job seekers group. And that's the essence of the policy.
At our last session on sanctions, Bill Scott from the organisation Inclusion Scotland, which works with disabled people here in Scotland, informed us that it was his understanding that the DWP and Job Centre Plus was operating a system whereby a certain proportion of those going through the system had to be sanctioned, a quota in essence. Is this true?
Absolute nonsense.
Absolute nonsense.
Absolute nonsense. And in fact, in one of the footnotes included in the memorandum, you can access, I'm sure the clerk can do this for you, you can access the report I did for the Secretary of State on this last year, which we published. So, you know, there was a set of benchmarks running until 2011, and ironically it's actually the coalition government that got rid of the benchmarks in 2011 because of the fact that if you set a target in this area, you will get behavioural responses from job centre staff that you don't want to happen here. Now, there have been, and my report pulls no punches about this, isolated examples where job centres have misunderstood the instructions and gone out and put local targets in place. Well, we've found that to be the case. We've taken quick action to remind them of what our policy is and what we want them to do in that area.
What was the instruction that was misunderstood?
Well, I'll tell you a little story here, but Job Centre Plus is a very target-focused organisation. It's one of the reasons it's so successful. And when the benchmarks were removed in 2011, and you'll see this in the sanctions data, a lot of people made the erroneous conclusion, senior managers have got rid of the benchmarks, therefore they don't want us to sanction people anymore. And you see a drop-off in sanctions total. So when we communicated that, no, that's not the case, we want you to sanction people appropriately, a number of people locally responded by putting in local targets. Conflating, you can't do anything in Job Centre Plus without a target being attached to it. Now, that's not the case, but that was the kind of simplistic way they thought about this. But as I say, it's set out in my report, and it's not a long report, so I hope you won't be bored reading it. And
you're saying the DWP is target-driven, but just it doesn't have a target category that you can tell us it doesn't have a
Job
target.
Centre Plus is a very target-driven organisation. For example,
the point I was going to make is you can categorically tell us one of the targets you're not driving is a set proportion of people going through the system have to be sanctioned.
Exactly, because targets can lead to some perverse behaviours. So whenever you're setting a target, you've got to be alive to those sorts of risks. And in this area, in the area of sanctions, we think a set of targets will drive perverse behaviours. You know, we want people sanctioned appropriately. It's part of the system. But we do not want, you know, the outcome we're looking for here is not more sanctioned people.
But
you want more people into work, that's what we're about.
You're saying the outcome, you don't want more sanctioned people, but the numbers of people being sanctioned now are higher than we were previously, aren't they?
They are higher. Whether it's a trend yet, we've got to wait for the next set of data to understand that. The other thing I think the committee needs to understand is we've increased the amount of contact that's going on with claimants. So the chances of sanctioning, for example, are going up simply because the number of interactions are going up between people. So we're, for example, young people we now pull in once a week as opposed to once every 2 weeks. And yesterday we announced Help to Work was starting, and that has a daily intervention regime for a number of people who've been 3 years plus unemployed. So the chances of having a sanction, you know, in terms of the interaction with the state organisation, is going up. So you might well see an increase in numbers, but that is not an outcome we are driving towards.
Okay. Well, I've spoken too long for a man with tonsillitis, so I'm going to turn to Alec Johnson.
I'm going to speak as long as I can for a man sitting next to a man with tonsillitis. The whole use of sanctions, of course, is controversial. But I wondered if you could briefly outline the reason why sanctions are used and the effectiveness of the cause and effect relationship of the use of sanctions.
Okay, well, I mean, the system's always had some form of contract in it between the person claiming benefits and the receipt of those benefits. In fact, it's no surprise that the last two governments have both talked about contracts and new contracts in their approaches to welfare reform. The last Labour government did, and the present coalition government does. The reason for a sanction is that where you've got a responsibility on a claimant to do something, there has to be a consequence for not doing the thing that you're asking them to do. So, in essence, you know, if you got rid of sanctions, for example, which I've heard some contributors say in giving evidence, you would have to get rid of, you know, any conditions on benefit, because otherwise there'd be, you know, they would essentially be toothless. What you want to ensure is that the sanction does, you know, drives the right behaviour, and what you're looking for is people engaging with the system rather than disengaging with the system. So this is a really careful balance to take place here. And rather than my organisation being sanction happy, the chances are if you went into a job centre and you observe what was going on there, what you would see is a lot more cases you could sanction that don't get sanctioned because advisors are using their common sense and intelligence to try and make judgments about which people are actively engaging and which people aren't, and need to be reminded of their responsibilities. Now, look, we're doing hundreds of thousands of interventions a week in 700 odd job centres across the country. We are bound to get some of those judgments wrong, but in general, you know, this is not an organisation that is chasing sanctions despite what you've been told, and it's certainly not the message I am giving out to people within the 30,000 people I lead across Great Britain doing this work.
There are very few people who, I'm sure, would see the being sanctioned as a positive. But to what extent or to what proportion of those who've experienced sanctions experience a positive outcome as a result?
Well, I mean, another way of thinking about this is how many people are sanctioned a second time. And typically, you're getting 80% of people, for example, on intermediate sanctions, who only have one sanction. So the people who are coming round 2 or 3 times, they're the people who I'm asking my advisors, work coaches, to look very carefully at what is going on here. Why are those people not engaging positively with the kind of help we've got to offer them in getting them into work? Because the job seekers allowance regime is a phenomenally successful policy intervention for getting people jobs. you know, 3/4 of people who claim JSA have left the benefit by 6 months. I mean, it is the benefit approach that's copied in a number of countries across the world because it is so successful, such successful intervention. So we know that getting somebody to comply with the system is the best route to getting them a job out of this.
Yeah, the experience we've had and the people we've talked to, there's one group that offers some cause for concern, and these are, to some extent, the group of people who have a rather disorganised or chaotic lifestyle. And it seems that they are more likely to experience sanctions, that once imposed, the sanctions are less likely to have the positive effect on these individuals, and that statistically they tend to be young men who end up in that category. First of all, is that your experience, and is there any specific support or effort being made to deal with that group who seem to fall out of the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Mark Ballard in the last session alluded to the position of homeless. I don't know whether he said young men. I can't recall now, but homeless people. And you know, his view was sanctions are never appropriate. I think I'm sort of half of the way there with Mark, in that you know, clearly you need to understand what is driving the non-compliant behaviour viewed from a kind of job centre perspective here. And I've certainly witnessed some really good work by my Gateshead Job Centre with the local charity there, the Cyrenians, who are responsible for some of the homeless hostels, who've actually gone in and explained to the hostel workers just what is going wrong with young hostel workers' job search and how we can help them not get sanctioned. Now, it doesn't mean we don't sanction them, because we still get, even after all that effort and explanation, people just not complying, not wanting to engage with the system. But I agree with your sort of suggestion that there are cases where you know, just piling straight in there with a sanction isn't the kind of appropriate response. That's why we ask work coaches and advisors to use their judgment in and around this. Now, again, you know, there will be instances where we get that wrong, but there'll also be instances where it is a great intervention. And one of the most pleasing things about when I visited you know, Gateshead and met some of the young people there was that we'd actually got people not just resettled in the community into properties outside of the hostels. We'd actually got them into jobs as well, and their lives are on the heel because of that. So this is, you know, this is not something that you can, you know, direct from a central chair and say, this is what you've got to do in this absolute circumstance. What you've got to do is empower, you know, work coaches to make the right decisions and to make some judgments around all of this. And that's what we try to do. So, for example, I've recently gone out to talk to the homeless charities through Homeless Link. We're doing the same thing kind of locally right across the country to review our relationships with a particular emphasis on where we are with sanctions, because of the, you know, the rub points here are quite hard, and we need to take particular care with this particular group of people.
Thank you.
Mr. Cullen, we've had a variety of people telling us, and you heard some of them today. We had people telling us previously that the sanctions regime is a major driver in the growth of food banks.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
No. I was thinking about, if you asked me this question, how I could help the committee understand a bit more just about the growth of food banks and kind of what is going on there. You know, and it was quite interesting, I thought, at the end of the last session, people were speculating about how could you stop the growth of food banks when, with something like the Trussell Trust, you know, they have an objective of putting a food bank in every town in Great Britain. I mean, that's been their stated objective since 2004. And I think it's really interesting to look at, you know, is this a demand-led growth or is this a supply-led growth? And I've got two bits of evidence I think I'll share with you, which for me suggests it's supply and not demand. The first thing is that if you take the Trussell Trust figures that they produced last a couple of weeks ago now where they said there's 1 million people have used food banks in the last year, and we're about a third, they reckon, of the whole food bank sector. So if you gross that up to 3 million and divide it by weekly usage, you get to a figure about 60,000. Okay, and that's being generous, grossing out. If I told you that in Canada, okay, with a population half the United Kingdom, so 32 million, the weekly use is 700,000, not 60,000, 700,000. Or if I told you that in Germany, Deutsche Tafel, who are the equivalent of the Trussell Trust, reckoned in 2009 they were helping 1 million Germans a week. Not 60,000, 1 million Germans a week. And their latest figures are 1.5 million Germans a week. You know, Germany is not some kind of welfare wasteland where there is no help available. That makes me think that supply is the issue that's driving that. And why would poor people respond in a different way to rich people would respond to there being incentives or things that you can claim or get? A second piece of evidence I would draw on is the 2006 experience with the Social Fund, where the last Labour government did 4 things. It reduced the rate of repayment. It extended the time over which you could repay your social fund loan. It increased the amount of money that you could borrow. And then it put it on the telephone so it was much more accessible to individuals and took away the face-to-face challenge that used to go on in job centres. Now, in the space of 3 years, the number of applications for crisis loans trebled. And ironically enough, it was the Conservative and Liberal Democrat opposition then who cited that as an example of greater crises, welfare problems, etc., etc. It wasn't. What we'd done was expand a service for people who haven't got very much money, and surprise, surprise, they applied for it. So, that's why my view very clearly is that this is a supply-led growth going on, and will continue to be growing over the years ahead, whatever the path of welfare policies are, because we live in a society where there are poor people and rich people, and people will maximise their economic choices. That's just how economies work.
Dr. Philip Zisenko of Heriot-Watt University told this committee that it is in fact the case that it is demand-led, not supply-led, and that the evidence in this is robust and reliable, and that welfare reform is a major factor fueling demand for food aid. And we have had a variety of people working with folk on the ground saying that when they come in, they're citing sanctions and other welfare reform matters as an issue. So that all these people, including Dr. Philip Zisenko, are wrong in this case. Well,
they should look at Germany and try and understand what's behind the growth in Germany.
With respect, Mr. Cullen, they've not looked at Germany, they've looked at what's happening here, on the ground here in Scotland and across the rest of the United Kingdom, and that's what they've found.
And people will, people will tell you things in order to maximise their economic choices. In the same way that people will tell you things that, I am looking for work, because they know the consequences. If they say I'm not looking for work, then they get sanctioned, and there are consequences. Similarly, people will present to food banks. Now, in their own, they may not. This may not be willful deceit going on. Okay, this may well be that this is their belief about the situations. The food banks will then record that, and then that will then be presented back as a fact. But that doesn't establish a causal link, and the supply argument is a much stronger argument than this. But what isn't going on is that academics are not exploring the supply argument. They are looking at what people are reporting in food banks and then citing that as evidence back. It doesn't make it right. That's just what they're doing.
I'm bound to say, Mr. Cullen, I find it a very unconvincing argument indeed, Mr. Stewart.
I would go as far as to say that that is complete and utter nonsense, and I would suggest that Mr.
Well, you just don't need to engage with it then. You just say it's complete and utter nonsense.
Well, I would suggest that you go and speak to folk at food banks like I have done, the workers there, the volunteers there, and those folks who are presenting themselves, who without doubt are facing major difficulties in their life, often due to sanctioning. But let's move off of that and let's look at some of the figures.
Well, let's
there
ignore
are.
what I said, shall we?
Mr. Cooling, we're here to question you, sir.
Hold on. We'll have the questions, then the answer. Finish your question, Kevin.
Some figures, convener. There have been a 209% increase in the number of benefit sanctions since 2006. The number of cases where a decision to sanction somebody's benefits was made has more than tripled, from 25,953 in 2006 to 80,305 in 2013. In that time, the single largest increase took place between 2012 and 2013, where there was an increase of 15,463 benefit sanctions in a single year. In your paper, Mr. Cooling, you say that you are looking for tough rather than cooperative attitudes from caseworkers. Is that the reason why there has been such a massive increase in such a short period of time?
Well, I don't agree there's been such a massive increase in the way in which you've set it out.
209%.
It's not a 209% increase.
House of Commons figures, Mr. Cooling, are they wrong?
Yes, they are in that sense, because the first thing you have to do is to look at the number of people on benefits. You can't just calculate off of, use a figure in 2006 and what unemployment was in 2006, and then compare it with today. It's a ridiculous calculation to make, to be quite honest.
So, ridiculous calculation from the House of Commons Library. Can I ask you about your tough and cooperative attitudes of caseworkers?
Indeed.
Is that tough rather than cooperative attitude leading to more sanctioning? And where does understanding actually come into play when it comes to your caseworkers?
Yeah, I mean, the international evidence here is clear, which I cited in the memorandum, paragraph 3, as an example. And we're trying to walk, a difficult path here between, showing understanding, being cooperative, but also putting some challenge. And it is true that, in some locations, and I've, witnessed one myself where our folk working there were quite open and honest, that, they hadn't been applying the regime, and that when they had started applying the regime, first of all, the claimants remarked on, what are you doing? We've never done this before. In fact, I met one where that was the case and was part of that interview. And that the results from that were positive and more people were getting jobs as a consequence. So, yes, we're doing both.
Let's look at that regime, and I want to look at cases that I know of from my own constituency, convener, and like many others around the table, our offices are inundated with folks coming to us to help them in very tragic situations often. This is a case that I was actually handed this morning, and it involves a man who has mental health problems, who has previously had addiction problems. At one point, he produced a sick line to triage and was told that it is still mandatory to attend work-related activity despite submitting a sick line. He was sanctioned for that. The sanction was eventually lifted after a caseworker from the Seat and Recovery Project intervened. What would you have to say about that kind of situation, Mr. Cooling?
Well, it doesn't sound that that's the correct application of the sanction process in that case.
But it seems to me that there are a lot of incorrect applications of the process. Can I move on?
Well, you might say that, but funnily enough, what I've started doing, because when members of the Scottish Parliament as well as MPs write to the Secretary of State about individual constituency cases, I've in the replies that often I get to write back, I've started citing what has gone on in the case back to the MSPs and back to the MPs, and I've not had one subsequent response back after I've done that. So where we make a mistake, I'm quite happy to admit that and put the case right, and if necessary, we will pay compensation to that individual. But there are also a number of cases who will present in your constituency surgeries who will tell you something has gone on, and that may not be the full facts of the case. You will get a partial representation to you.
Okay, so in terms of that scenario, that Triage said that despite having submitted a sick line, it is still mandatory to attend work-related activity. That would be wrong.
A sick line, sorry, I don't understand that.
A doctor's note saying that somebody was unfit to attend.
In terms of what their condition was, I think you'd have to ask there. So, for example, if it was just a repetition of the medical condition that they had expressed in the work capability assessment, then there is a chance the individual will say, well, we know you have that medical condition, we still want you to attend the kind of help we're offering you here. Or it may be a new, it could be that they'd contracted tonsillitis or something, and they weren't and they weren't well enough to attend.
So we're now.
I don't know enough about the case to tell you.
But
yes, it's absolutely right or wrong.
We're in a situation whereby if somebody presents a note from their doctor saying that they're unfit, Triage will not necessarily take that as being the case that they're unfit.
I mean, there is a danger in the system, and I thought you might ask me about people who move from employment support allowance. They're found capable of work in the work capability assessment. They then present, they present in the job centre and then bring medical evidence and say, I'm not well enough, I should be on ESA, and there can be quite a nasty feedback loop if we're not very careful around that. So I wonder if you're going to ask me about that, because...
No, I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you about this situation where it seems that doctors' medical advice is being ignored. If I could move on with the same case, convener, where the man... Was
that a question, that last bit, or was that a statement?
It was a statement.
Okay,
when the man later
I didn't agree with you there.
Convener...
I would rather we speak one at a time, otherwise it could get out of hand. Carry on, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Later on, the same gentleman received a call from a triage office saying that he had to be available to take a phone call at a said time. He phoned the triage office, was told that they were running late and that they would call soon. Nobody called. This was on a Friday. The man phoned and got an answering machine over the course of the weekend. Said gentleman extremely concerned that he was going to be sanctioned again. As I said earlier, mental health problems, convener. On the Sunday afternoon, with worry, he phones Police Scotland and is admitted to the Royal Cornhill Hospital and spent 2 weeks in that hospital at God knows what cost to the public purse. Is that the tough regime that you want to see, the tough rather than cooperative regime that you want to see? And is this a case of cost shunting and creating even more crises in people's lives?
I don't think it's a case of cost shunting. It sounds like a case of where we failed to phone the person back that we promised to.
And how often are these failures taking place, Mr. Cooley? How often is it that people are forced to take drastic actions because there are these failures in the system?
Okay, well, I'm currently running on 3-hour callbacks, so the requirement is to phone claimants back every 3 hours at about 96%. So we're not hitting 100% of that at the moment, but in 96% of cases, we are making the 3-hour callback.
You talked of compensation earlier. Can I ask how much there has been in terms of compensation in the past year to folks who have been sanctioned against all of the rules that you have in place?
I don't have that figure to hand, but I'm happy to provide it.
I think that would be extremely useful. And in terms of compensation, Convener, while monetary compensation is one thing, how do we compensate those folks who are put through the mill and end up in situations like the gentleman that I've described, where he's had to spend time in a mental health unit for 2 weeks after failures in the system?
Yeah, well, clearly, you know, that sounds like a terribly regrettable case.
There are many of them in my office. I could go on, Convener, but I'll give others the opportunity.
Alec, you wanted to come back in?
I think I'll wait until later and come back on this
I suppose just because we get a comment after I've answered a question and then I'm not allowed to answer back, I just want to say one thing there, which is that, you know, clearly I personally regret any case where we get it wrong. But you can't, I don't think, and it's a mistake, to infer a general view of the system and the efficacy of a sanctions regime from the cases when we get it wrong. It's a bit like looking at, you know, victims of domestic fire and only talking to them about, and to get an understanding of how effective your fire prevention policy is. So, you know, I totally, you know, put my hand up and say that should not have happened. But that does not then, or from my perspective, should then not lead to a conclusion, well, then everything is wrong. Because that isn't the case, because as the memorandum shows, the sanctions regime, our overall approach to an active benefits regime is having positive impacts in terms of rising employment, falling unemployment, and numbers of people on benefits. I wouldn't want the committee to lose sight of that, because, you know, that is a really important question, I think, for our system design and going forward.
Okay, what I will say, Mr. Cullen, is I don't want to stop you saying whatever you want to say. You're here to give us evidence today, so if it seems I'm trying to do that, I apologise, but if you want to raise any point at any stage, then you're able to do so, I can assure you. Ken, then Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask Mr. Cullen, clearly you make a number of positive claims for the effect that sanctions are having in getting people back into the workforce, into the job market. Do you agree that there are also negative impacts and negative repercussions of the sanctions regime?
Could you give me an example of what you consider a negative impact would be?
In today's context, there's the rise and the increase in the use of food banks. Do you think that sanctions have had any role in that whatsoever?
Well, clearly, people will present to food. If somebody is sanctioned, they will have no benefit income for the period of the sanction unless they claim for hardship. So those individuals will present to food banks. And in fact, there have been, you know, sanctions, as I say, in the benefit system since its very start. So, you know, is that a negative outcome? Well, clearly, I think when somebody has been sanctioned, it is a failure of the system. We have failed in one sense, as well as that individual failing. They've put themselves in that circumstance. Whether I say it's a negative connotation, I don't know. It depends how you define negative.
When you were talking about, when we had the discussion earlier, the convener was asking you about the rise in the use of food banks. We talked about demand and supply. You were talking about other examples from abroad, Germany and Canada, also about America and other ones. But do you think, is it the government's intention for food banks to be institutionalised in this country? Because clearly that's a different approach to food banks.
Well, as the Department for Work and Pensions, one of the things we've been saying, and you know, to paraphrase it a bit, is that actually the growth in food banks are nothing to do with us. I mean, you know, they are a community, as somebody's pointed out, they're a community-led response. We support them to the extent that you know, we signpost people from job centres to them. But I don't think the government has a policy on their growth or otherwise.
I just think that when we're clearly looking at food banks as well as the welfare reforms generally, the welfare, the states that you talked about, food banks are an integral part of their approach to welfare. Whereas in our country, we've never had that approach. Food banks have always been there as a charitable response from the community, but it's not part of our welfare system. Does the government I'm not sure if you can answer for the government, but I mean, are we not even concerned that we're developing a system where food banks are absolutely an integral part of welfare rather than just a charitable response?
Well, I don't think it's been proved that they're an integral part of the welfare system. They're clearly, responding to a desire of people to contribute to them. They're a charitable establishment in the main, although I think the Scottish Government has given some funding to food banks in Scotland. So they're outside of the kind of the government state sphere, and in general, general UK government policy is to applaud voluntary and community action. I mean, Trussell Trust, for example, I mean, it's essentially for them started out as an evangelical device, a desire to get in touch with, to get religious groups in touch with their local communities. That was using food banks to do that. Now, the government doesn't have, as far as I know, doesn't have a policy on evangelism.
No, it seems like clearly you've justified sanctions in terms of employment and unemployment. But the welfare state is far more than just employment and unemployment. It's about supporting people in their time of need. And clearly, if you sanction people and you leave them with very little or nothing, then they'll have to find something. That in some ways is a breakdown of the welfare system. It might not be proof that sanctions isn't working, but it's a fundamental breakdown. It's a hole in the net of welfare. Well, it's a hole because it's a big hole in the net of welfare.
Yeah, well, I think I tried to answer this to Mr. Johnson's question. If you put in your system design, if you put an absolute premium on providing support in absolutely every circumstance, then you wouldn't have a system of sanctions. Okay. We have a system of sanctions in the United Kingdom because popular support for the welfare system rests on there being responsibilities as well as rights, and that for the individuals concerned by challenging them about their job search activity, that has a positive effect for them in that it often returns a lot of people onto a path of proper job seeking with a job at the end of it. So that's why we have them. If you accept that, then it is in the nature of a sanction that there will be some kind of implication for not meeting your responsibilities. And there isn't an easy design way around that. So if you buy into the fact that the system has to have rights and responsibilities in it, there has to be some consequences for not meeting up to those responsibilities. But if you don't, it is possible to conceive of a benefit system running kind of without sanctions. I'll give you another bit of evidence because, I mean, Dr. Webster didn't do this when he spoke to you because he did, some pieces on the history of the system. Well, the one thing he didn't take you through was the experience in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, during that big recession that happened then, under pressure, my predecessors basically abandoned the sanctions and conditionality regime. Unemployment grew to 3 million. It was probably going to grow to 3 million. That was the nature of the economy. What's interesting was that unemployment stayed at 3 million until 1986 and only starts to downturn when we reintroduce what's called restart then back into the system. And the counterfactual to that, to prove that it works, is you look at the 1990s recession where we worked really hard as we did in the 2008 recession to hang on to the conditionality regime, and unemployment falls very fast after the 1990 recession, and indeed in the 2008 recession unemployment is much lower than most external commentators were suggesting it would be. I mean, some former members of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee were saying it was going to rise to 5 million, and it doesn't. It actually peaks at about 2.5 to 2.6 million and is now falling back down towards 2 million. So we think the evidence for a system working is there, and when we didn't have that system, we saw some very kind of negative outcomes for it from both general society's point of view, but those 3 million people who stayed unemployed for 5, 6, 7 years as a consequence.
Okay. Can I just ask you about the use of sanctions itself? You said earlier that there's no targets and you abolished the use of benchmarks. Do you believe there's a problem with the unfair application of sanctions. And as evidence of that, the fact that more than half of appeals against sanctions are successful, that would be just one indicator.
Okay. Well, I think, first of all, I am concerned about that we get the application right. I've spent a lot of time working on this sort of within the organisation. But there is a bit of a misreading of the statistics going on as well. I mean, I think it was Jamie Livingston who said that 40–50% of decisions are wrong. And it is possible to look at the statistics if you don't understand how the sanction system works to draw that erroneous conclusion. So I'm not having a go at Jamie for misunderstanding all of this, but it is a misunderstanding about what's going on. And if you like, because I can see Ms Ewing looks as unpersuaded.
Well, what is the figure?
Okay.
He mentioned 58% of sanctioned cases are successfully overturned.
Yeah.
Hold on. I know that Mr Coulson was commenting on your demeanour.
No, it's all right.
You can get a chance in a minute. Carry on, Mr Coulson.
I moaned earlier. I'll stop moaning. Which is, I mean, if you go to paragraph 28 of the memorandum that we produce, I tried to explain this here. I mean, essentially, we are required to send cases from job centres to decision makers, sometimes even when we don't think the case should be sanctioned. But just be reassured, the committee, the cases are not sanctioned at the point at which we send them to the decision maker. So the cases that get a suspension, and it's the suspension that goes on in the job centres, we're getting, as I kind of set out in paragraph 29, 83% of those referrals are upheld, with a further 6 cancelled. Now, cancellation will tend to occur for things like the person's got a job, they've signed off benefit, so the sanction's no longer appropriate. So it may have been right, may have been wrong. And of the adverse cases, so of the 10 out of 100 cases we get wrong, 2 of those ask for a reconsideration. And of those, less than half get overturned at appeal. So you're talking about 1 out of 100 of the actual kind of cases when we're making decisions, we're absolutely certain in job centres this case should be sanctioned. 1 out of 100, not 40 or 50%. But what you're seeing in the statistics is that because we're asked to refer cases, the biggest example is leaving work voluntarily. Basically, if you've got a previous employer, all of those cases get referred to a decision maker, even when we think the employers behave badly. But the case has to be investigated. In the statistics, that shows up as a case we got wrong, in inverted commas. Okay, but you know, it's got some frustration in the job centres about this. We haven't got that case wrong. It's just the process requires us to send the case off, but the individual is not sanctioned in that case. Okay, the decision comes afterwards. So, you know, that's what I'm saying here. It is possible to look at some of these statistics and to get an erroneous impression from them about what is actually going on.
Could you ask one of the elements, though, but other than the appeals, there's an issue about fairness around consistency or lack of consistency. Now, clearly, if you're not benchmarking, how do you assess whether or not from one job centre to another, you know, the same process is being followed and the same criteria being applied? Just one little example to illuminate it. West Dunbartonshire CAB produced quite a hard-hitting report recently talking about the impact of sanctions. And I think it was anecdotal, but certainly anecdotally, it was then reported back that the number of sanctions in West Dunbartonshire declined. Certainly there's Dr Webster, who you talked about earlier, has tried to do some analysis which shows that there is variation between areas of Scotland, within areas, between the number of claimants and others. Now, clearly, that inconsistency by itself will create unfairness. Do you recognise that?
I do, and I am concerned about it. And in fact, you know, I've advertently put pressure on myself and my organisation by recommending, when I did the review to the Secretary of State last year, that we publish the data down to individual job centre level. So in the September statistics, for the first time, you'll see effectively all of the management information I have at my sort of fingertips set out for everybody. So there's no place to hide on any of these sanction numbers for anybody in Job Centre Plus. it is apparent what Job Centre A and Job Centre B are doing and comparing between the two. There is too much variation. So in the memorandum at paragraph 31, I've set out just some of the things we're launching this year as part of our new operational year. Effectively a full check, looking at every case to see whether the evidence is there to support the decision going off. We're also having managers sit in on interviews and working out, has that individual wrongly referred somebody for a sanction, or the alternative, failed to sanction somebody when that would have been, the right course of action to take. So we're investing quite a lot of activity in this. I have to say it is very difficult without a target to do, because what does good look like? And you will get lots of discussion around what does good look like. So I've reduced it down to the individual cases. So I don't know whether this will comfort Mr. Stewart or not, but we're actually looking at every case and trying to decide have we made the right decision on this, because of the fact that there just is too much variation in the system for me to be confident about. When you get to kind of district level, the variations are not so big, but when you get down to some of the job centres, you've got some really wide variance. The other thing we've done is that we look at the kind of outliers. So the bottom 10 offices and the top 10, we have these things called Go Look See visits, where we've sent people in from outside just to work out what's going on there. Are there other issues going on here? So we're taking this issue very, very seriously. But it isn't an easy one to crack, because ultimately these are subjective decisions that individuals are making based on the evidence that they get presented with. And of course a reconsideration process will often throw up evidence that wasn't presented at the time that you made the decision as well. So this is an imperfect science here.
One last question, Convener, in this section. I began by just asking whether you accepted there were any. You made some positive claims for sanctions, whether you accept there's a series of negative effects and impacts. And you talked about having external people come in and look at your work. Are you aware of reports from people, for example, recently from SAMH, which is the Mental Health Association of Scotland, and also by the Deep End group of GPs, Dr. Epp referred to earlier, that's the 100 GP practices in the 100 most deprived practices in Scotland. Both reports focus specifically on the fact that stress levels, mental health has been affected severely by the sanctions and the welfare reform regime, and that it is creating not just a personal effect, but clearly a demand on other parts of the state as well. Do you accept that that has happened?
I haven't seen those reports. The system itself is designed to, I've talked about rights and responsibilities before, that we are challenging people in ways that perhaps they haven't been challenged before, whether that's having some consequences outside of the sphere of social security. That could well be the case, but I just haven't seen those reports. Am I concerned about that? Well, I think we're dealing here with some quite deep-seated problems. And one of I think the best things that's happened in the last 10 years worth of kind of state delivery is the coming together of agencies to work together more here. And I was hearing of a case in England down in Margate recently where an individual who we would have normally sanctioned, he was a lone parent, he had children, was struggling with his job search. But when we contacted other agencies, we found out his children were misbehaving at school and getting suspended from school. And that when the health authorities went into the home, they found that the individual concerned, his wife had died and he had no idea how to care for his children, basically. They were misbehaving at school because they were hungry and they were being teased because they were dirty and hadn't been cleaned and so forth. So the intervention there was effectively putting in a super nanny to explain to him how to keep house, how to look after children. The children's behaviour at school then improved to such an extent that he could then get a job. So I think there is a case for, going forward, state agencies, however they're kind of configured, working more closely together here, because the kind of issues we are encountering in our work are also issues that other state agencies are encountering, where we're not turned up. I wouldn't call it as, as was said earlier, this is cost shifting. I think it's inadvertently organisations, with the best of intentions, just creating more negative outcomes. So this coming together, which is going on across the United Kingdom under various initiatives. In England, it's Troubled Families. In Scotland, this was already well developed because of the devolution settlement anyway. I think is the way forward.
Thank you. Libby.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Cooling. Just to pick up on a few points. You mentioned in your earlier remarks that the vast increase in recourse to food banks was not demand-led but was supply-led, and you also used phrases like willful deceit and maximising economic position, if I recall correctly. But we've also heard, this committee has heard on a number of occasions, including in the previous evidence session, which I understand that you listened into, that the considerable increase in sanctions being imposed by the DWP has had an impact, has led to increased recourse to food banks. We've also heard that the Trussell Trust in the last year in Scotland have reported that 22,387 children have used their food bank facilities. So I just want to be clear, are you saying that these children are engaged in willful deceit, or are you saying that these children are maximising their economic position by going to a food bank or having had to have recourse to a food bank? Are you saying that these children are not hungry?
No.
No. Okay, so that's...
Well, it was a ridiculous question, wasn't it?
Excuse me?
It was a ridiculous question.
Well, I find that actually...
It was twisting the words that I'd said and then trying to throw them back at me. Look,
Mr Coulson, you said those words. I gave you the opportunity to recant.
Yes,
you said those words, and the fact of the matter is that the imposition of sanctions by the DWP, particularly in the unfair, overly bureaucratic, inflexible way in which they are being imposed, is having an impact, and is having an impact on children who have got nothing to do with the situation. They're hungry, they need the food. The DWP is taking the ability of their parents away to feed them. But you've given me a one-word answer to that question. So if we could move on to the issue of mental health. We are helpfully provided by our clerks with... Mr Cooling can come back in a minute if he wishes on that issue. We are helpfully provided by our clerks with a kind of weekly digest of various activities in the field of welfare reform. And in the one that we were provided for with respect to this meeting, there was reference to a recent FOI to the DWP in respect of those who have ESE claimants with mental health conditions and the level of sanctions. And in terms of the report here, the FOI disclosed that the proportion of those claimants, ESA claimants, hit with a sanction with having a mental health condition has increased from 35% of sanctioned claimants in 2009 to a massive 58% in 2013. So going back to your comments a moment ago on mental health issues raised by my colleague, perhaps you would care to comment on that particular disturbing report.
Well, I will comment on that. I'll also comment on the children point, because I think there is a chance that those without a detailed knowledge of the benefit system might be inadvertently misled about a position around children and sanctioning. What we sanction is the single adult component of somebody's benefit entitlement. So, for example, a family who are sanctioned, the amount initially sanctioned is £71. The amounts for child benefit, child tax credit, housing, if it's a two-parent family, the money for the couple are untouched. We then, and those families then qualify for a hardship payment, which adds back in 60% of that £71. Okay? So these are not families, these are not children being left with no money at all. And it is a misleading thing to suggest that that is the case. Now, in the question of the increase from, I think, did you say 34% to 56? If I got that wrong, I apologise.
35 to 58 in terms of the DWP's own figures there.
Okay. What we're talking about is a very small number of people. So, for example, of people in the ESA RAG group, we're talking 1% of the total. So that increase is statistically significant if you look at the number of people who have been sanctioned. As the total but as a total of the population on employment support allowance, it is infinitesimally small.
Well, it's presumably of importance to those who are suffering the sanctions. And on the issue of the children, I mean, I don't know, maybe if you realise that money coming into a household that is severely under pressure, particularly a lone parent, for example, take away a bit of that money, and that household is severely under pressure. I don't know if you really understand that, Mr. Cooley, in terms of the remarks you just made to this committee.
But it was the suggestion that somehow families are being left with no money because of sanctioning that I was trying to correct, because that is a misleading impression.
Can I ask, then, it may be that you don't have the figures to hand, but how many cases, then, of sanctions in Scotland are hardship payments made, and how many cases, what percentage of cases? All cases? 50%? 1%?
In terms of the national picture, I have no reason to doubt that the position in Scotland is any different. Around 90% of applications for hardship payments are met.
How many cases of sanctions are, well, that begs the question, how many applications are made, what signposting there is to hardship payments. So that wasn't really the question. The question was, in cases where sanctions are applied, how many hardship payments are made. You could then break that down into cases where there has been an application, cases where there has not been an application.
Okay, well, let me see if I've got this somewhere.
To be fair, Ms. Gooding, I did preface it by saying that obviously if you have the information, we'd be happy to receive it. I do appreciate that I'm not expecting you to have all the statistics in your head at the moment.
I'm just slightly infuriated. I was looking at it this morning.
But if I could just, there are some technical issues I wanted to deal with also. And in the memorandum that you refer to, which I have to say is about 6.5 pages of A4 text and 1.5 pages of an annex. So for those who have not had the ability to see it yet, it's not exactly a kind of tome. But in the memorandum that we have before us, I don't see anything addressing the issue of communication, because that, in terms of the evidence we have received thus far, and I think you've had the opportunity to read it, is a very considerable concern that has been raised. And the question really has been posed, why is there not prior written communication in every case where money has been withdrawn? And that's certainly not happening on the ground.
Okay, well, look, the memorandum is not a tome, because the committee asks for non-tomes, for very good reasons, I'm sure, not to be sent to you. But if you follow the footnotes, there's a wealth of reading that you can while away the summer hours looking at. In terms of communications and so forth, the committee will know we've asked Matt Oakley to do a review of that. I didn't put in the memorandum what we're doing there, because obviously we've got to wait for Matt to report, and then the government has to respond to that. So in a sense, though, what I would say is to the committee is, people who are sanctioned will often say they were not aware. Okay, and sometimes we do get this wrong, but a lot of the time that is what people will say as well. So when we go back and document and show them that in their claimant commitment or job seekers agreement, they'd agreed to take these following steps, we had warned them, they have had conversations with their advisors about this. you know, there's an acceptance, then perhaps I was communicated with. But I do know it is one of the things that Matt Oakley is looking at, and you know, the government will respond to that, I'm sure, when we have the report.
Sorry, just to clarify, so you said that you gave these scenarios where people, have been communicated with. Are you saying they've been communicated with in writing, or some other form of communication?
Well, the claimant commitment is in writing.
No, but the fact that the sanction is being imposed, has been imposed, is that always communicated in this communication process you referred to in writing or not?
They will get a communication.
Do they get that before or after?
It depends on the nature of the sanction. So there are three different types. This memorandum puts out sort of low, intermediate, and high. And some of those decisions are it will feel like they haven't been told they've been sanctioned on an intermediate decision, because technically they won't have been. Their benefit will have been suspended, and they may feel you haven't communicated me the decision on the sanction. Well, technically speaking, a decision hasn't been made on their case yet. Their benefit has been suspended. Now, on that case, they will orally know that, but the way in which that's done isn't always as clear as it could be, because in the job centre, the person may talk about, I have to refer your case to a decision maker, which not always will a claimant understand that could mean, and you won't be paid benefit this week. So that is, I can't prejudge what Mr. Oakley will say, but certainly I think that's a bit of the process where we could tighten up and help claimants more understand. Yeah,
I think there's maybe a slight misunderstanding of language here, because you made the point earlier that a suspension is somehow very different from a final sanction decision. But as far as I can understand from what you're saying, and indeed the evidence we've taken, a suspension can mean no money coming into that person's bank account. Now, for that person, to all intents and purposes, that is in effect a decision that has been made, because instead of the money going into the bank account where they expect it to be with no written communication and having children to feed, they then don't have any money. So for them, that is a decision in effect that has been taken. It may not be called in your book a sanctions decision, but it is a decision not to pay them the money that they had been expecting when they've had no prior communication to that effect, and they have got mouths to feed at home.
We're agreeing.
Perhaps you can see where people feel that this system isn't working.
I'm agreeing. That's exactly what I just said, but not.
So therefore, if that is the case, that the suspension actually means that money does not get paid, how then, going back to your appeal figures, how does that stack up? Because we heard from Oxfam that it's 58% overturn rate in terms of when sanctions are applied. Perhaps that's the phraseology that you have the problem with. When suspensions are applied, i.e. when the money is not paid, would that then not be a fair representation of what the overturn rate is? Because it goes back to the point, if you don't get the money, the DWP can call that whatever it likes, but to the recipient, that's a problem.
It's 1%, as I explained earlier.
1% of all cases where money has not been paid, be it suspension.
Suspended. Yeah, in suspension. It's a 1% overturn rate.
Right, okay. And my last question, I appreciate, Convener, that we've moved on and time is pressing, but one of the issues that arose when a small delegation of our committee went to speak to people who have been impacted by benefit sanctions, and one of the issues that arose was the apparent disregard for any voluntary work carried out by the claimants. And this felt to me that it was a bit short-sighted, and surely it would be to be applauded that the individual is seeking to move on, and if there is no job available, is seeking to do something to contribute to society. Would you care to comment why voluntary work cannot be recognised?
Well, voluntary work is recognised. It's recognised within the system. But often where there's a sort of conflict or clash arises is because where the advisor may think the voluntary work is getting in the way of somebody's job search, then that's where you can get this. So we actually encourage voluntary work. It's a good way of filling a CV. And in fact, having gaps on a CV is one of the biggest problems job seekers face. But so there's no blanket ban on voluntary work, but where an advisor thinks that the individual's voluntary work is not helping them with their job seeking. So, you know, they've done it for a while, their CV's now up to date, they should be doing job search rather than voluntary work. That's where you will find these cases put to you, and then it will be expressed to you as they won't allow my voluntary work. And I'm sure from that individual's perspective, that's exactly how they feel. But that's not the system, that's not the rules doing that.
Maybe it was in this instant case that the person didn't feel that there was any conflict with the universal job match search continuing and the voluntary work being carried on apace. One very last, very brief question. You mentioned on the last page of your memorandum that the DWP issued on 8th April a full quality assurance framework and checklist for staff that work in DWP job centres, and this to be implemented consistently from 28th April 2014. Would it be possible to forward the committee a copy? Great.
Very happy.
Thank you. Annabelle, as you point out, time is moving on, so I think that is the conclusion of our session. Is everyone happy? Yeah. Can I thank you then, Mr. Coogan, for coming on. I do appreciate you coming on today. I think it's probably safe to say you didn't agree with everything you had to say, but we do appreciate you coming to give us your time. That said, I continue, and I think other members of the committee continue to believe that we would benefit by the attendance on the record and in public of a minister than the DWP, and it is something we'll continue to pursue. As agreed at the start of today's meeting, we will now move into private session.